The wind comes first, a dry, restless sound dragging over the short-grass plains of Texas, 1873. A rider leans low in the saddle, dust curling behind his horse like smoke from a slow fire. His shirt is sun-bleached to the color of bone, his hat a permanent part of his shadow. In his saddlebag, salt, a few cartridges, and a letter from a rancher 2 counties over, promising $10 for a week's drive. In the distance, a line of cattle flickers across the horizon, hundreds of longhorns moving like a single nervous muscle. The man's name might be Tom or Eli or Hank. The names don't matter much out here. What matters is daylight, water, and a horse that can still feel its hooves. To the east, 2 newspapermen from Chicago ride in a borrowed wagon, their collars too tight for the heat. They've come west to write about the cow country, the great wild experiment of the American frontier. They see men like Tom as relics, dusty, unlearned, a curious breed halfway between farmer and outlaw. They jot down words like uncivilized, roughneck, illiterate. They chuckle when a cowboy tips his hat and says "mornin' gents" in a drawl that bends vowels like slow rope. But the camera, if there were one, would see something else. The precision in the man's hands as he knots a cinch, the quiet focus in his eyes while judging the storm line on the northern edge of the sky, the conversation between his boot heels and the ground, the kind of knowledge you don't get from books but from miles. Out here, survival is literacy. The cowboy wasn't born a symbol. He was a job, a set of hard tasks done for low pay and little thanks. In 1870, a trail hand earned about $1 a day, slept on dirt, and risked his life for someone else's cattle. Yet those same men kept open the arteries of a nation in motion. They bridged distances the railroads hadn't yet claimed, driving millions of head north from Texas to Kansas railheads, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita. They rode through blizzards and heat waves, across rivers swollen with spring flood water. They repaired saddles with rawhide and mended cuts with a needle meant for canvas. When a horse went lame, they walked. When lightning scattered the herd, they rode blind into the stampede, trusting only their instincts and the sound of hooves. No college could have taught that kind of calculation, the weight of risk versus time, or the moral math of keeping men alive on an open trail. Still, from the city's point of view, they were merely cowhands, almost ornamental to progress. The New York Tribune once called them the unpolished residue of the frontier. Eastern writers dressed in store-bought adventure came west to watch them work and then wrote about primitive labor as though swinging a rope was something beneath dignity. What they didn't understand was that these men were the logistics core of expansion, the invisible hands turning wilderness into a market. Every fence line staked, every herd delivered, every trail marked and hoofprints carved. The pathways later followed by surveyors, merchants, settlers, and trains. Night falls on the plains like a closing hand. The herd beds down, bellies full of buffalo grass. The men roll cigarettes from rough-cut tobacco and stare into the coals. Someone strums a battered guitar. The talk is low about horses gone bad, women left behind, and whether the next drive will take them closer to the rail or further into the unknown. No one calls it history, it's just the way life is. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote calls. One of the newspapermen scribbles in his notebook, "Primitive songs, men of no schooling." He doesn't write down the arithmetic behind their days, how a foreman calculates wind direction before a crossing, or how a cook judges flour and salt ratios by palm weight. He doesn't note that most of these men can ride 40 miles, rope a steer, mend a broken axle, and still have enough sense to trade fare with the Comanche when they meet at the river. He only sees the dust, the drawl, the laughter. By the late 1870s, the joke of the cowboy had become a fixture in Eastern magazines. The rawhide philosopher, the sagebrush fool. Cartoonists sketched them as gangly hayseeds with bad grammar and worse manners. To the urban elite, the West was a stage and the cowboy a prop. But the land itself didn't laugh. The same men mocked for their speech were laying down the practical grit of an empire. Their trails would harden into roads, their stock camps into towns. Their makeshift corrals would become supply depots, rail junctions, even state capitals. And the tough, unlettered hands that drove herds through dust storms were quietly setting the foundation for a national economy that would feed the cities doing the mocking. Every insult was answered, wordlessly, with work. And if anyone had asked those men what they thought of the city's opinion, they might have spat in the dust and said, "Ain't my business what a man behind a desk thinks of dirt." By dawn, the riders are already in motion again. The herd restless, the newspapermen tired and sore pack their notebooks and head back east. In their pages, they'll describe a curious, primitive breed of laborer. What they'll never mention is how those same laborers led them through land they couldn't have crossed alone. The sun climbs, the day begins again, another trail, another 100 miles of silence between hoofbeats. Somewhere out there, in the shimmering distance, A telegraph line is being planned, and the first steel rails, not yet laid, are being surveyed along the very paths these men are cutting now. They don't know it, but history is already following their tracks. As the cattle trails deepen into ruts and the world begins to move faster, the cowboys' work will collide with something new: rails, money, and machines, and the frontier will never look the same again. The rails came like iron veins across the open chest of the continent. By 1880, the cow trails that had once stitched the frontier northward from Texas were now running parallel to something faster, a line of black steel that whistled and hissed where cattle once thundered. The frontier economy wasn't born in a boardroom. It grew out of necessity, the quiet barter between dust and distance. A cowboy, a rancher, a blacksmith, a surveyor, they were all pieces of the same engine. Each knew his part. Where the herds went, the markets followed. Where the markets grew, the rails reached. And where the rails ended, the cowboys rode on. When Joseph McCoy built the stockyards at Abilene in 1867, he didn't just open a market, he created a supply chain. Before that, beef was a local economy. After McCoy, it became a national one. Cattle raised in South Texas could be driven north for 600 miles, loaded onto trains, and sold in Chicago's Union stockyards to feed cities like New York and Boston. The cowboy became the first true link between rural production and urban consumption, the unsung logistics man of an industrial age still learning its own hunger. But for every shipment of cattle that left the plains, something else came back. Tools, wire, cloth, salt, glass, and money. The West began to breathe in rhythm with the East, each dependent on the other. And yet the men who made that connection, the riders, drovers, and ranch hands, still carried the stigma of ignorance. Eastern writers called it irony, cowboys called it a living. In 1875, a steer might fetch $30 in Kansas City, triple its value in Texas. But to reach that price, men had to drive it across 2 states of wild country. A herd of 3,000 cattle could take 3 months to move, burning through supplies, horses, and men. They'd cross rivers that drowned whole teams, ride under sun that blistered skin to leather, and sleep in dust so thick it turned their beards gray. Money was made by endurance, not speculation. The West's economy wasn't built on theory. It was a physical chain of trust, forged through handshakes, letters carried in saddlebags, and the reputation of men whose word was worth more than any ledger. The cowboy might not have written contracts, but he understood the law of work. Do what you said you'd do. In that world, dishonesty was its own bankruptcy. Every ranch was its own factory. Blacksmiths turned broken axles into hinges. Saddle makers stitched gear from hide. Windmills, steel towers rising out of nowhere pumped water for herds and men. You could see the future taking shape, one tool at a time. The telegraph came next, running alongside the rails like a nervous system. Messages crossed states in minutes instead of weeks. Cowboys riding near the lines would pause to listen, not to the words but the clicking rhythm of progress. They could feel something shifting, something larger than herds or wages. And with every new invention came a quiet fear. Would the world still need men like us? By the early 1880s, the open range began to close. Barbed wire, Joseph Glidden's Devil's Rope, stretched across Texas and Oklahoma, ending the great drives. To the ranchers, it was efficiency. To the cowboys, it was a fence across freedom. The frontier economy was evolving from motion to management. Ranches became businesses. Stockyards became corporations. The cowboy's labor, once measured in miles, was now measured in output and cost. And yet the foundation remained his, built by men who could read the land better than any map. Still, the myth of his ignorance persisted. In the city, people joked that a cowboy could barely sign his name. Out here, that same man could track a lost steer by hoof pattern, patch a broken wagon tongue with mesquite wood, and rope a horse mid-gallop without spilling his coffee. If that was ignorance, it was the kind the nation was built on. The frontier economy was more than cattle and rails. It was an education in movement. Farmers learned to ship grain, miners learned to trade ore. Small towns became depots, depots became junctions, and junctions became cities. The American map was changing shape, less about borders, more about routes. And at the heart of every route was a cowboy's trail, paved first by hoof prints and later by steel. By the end of the century, the West was no longer a frontier, it was an economy. But the men who had carried it on their backs weren't invited into the counting rooms. They stayed outside, still wearing dust, watching trains full of cattle rumble east, hearing their own labor echo through the rails. They didn't resent it, they understood it. Progress had always been a trade, something gained, something lost. In the wind, As the last trail herds vanished and the telegraph lines hummed, there was a silence that only men of the saddle could hear. A door had closed, and the West they built was already being sold by men who'd never set foot in it. But before that door shut for good, one generation would leave behind more than fences and trails. They'd leave behind a code, a way of work and honor that would outlive the open range. As the rails spread and the range shrank, a new kind of cowboy emerged. Not just a rider, but a craftsman, a builder, a man shaping the tools of a modern world. The saddle creaks like an old voice remembering. It's 1884, somewhere near San Angelo, Texas. Dawn cuts through the mesquite like fire through paper. Men rise stiff from their bedrolls, faces half hidden under the brims of their hats. Coffee boils in a black pot balanced on stones. Horses nicker low, already sensing the day's long rhythm. Rope, ride, mend, repeat. These are the men of the saddle. Not knights, not outlaws, just working men who learned early that comfort was a luxury the land didn't offer. Their world runs on repetition and judgment, knowing how to tie the right knot for the right job, how to feel weather through the soles of their boots, how to spot sickness in a steer before it spreads. Each task done right means survival. Each mistake, a loss counted in blood or hide. The tools of their trade are few but precise. The rawhide rope, the branding iron, the slicker rolled tight behind the cantle, a Winchester carbine for snakes or rustlers. Everything has weight, purpose, and memory. The saddle itself, a man's seat, shield, and sometimes his grave. To outsiders, cowboying looked like brute labor. To those who lived it, it was an art form measured in efficiency. The average cowboy could judge a herd's drift by the lay of the land, anticipate where a stampede would turn, and navigate back to camp by the feel of the wind. They weren't guessing, they were reading data. Only, their books were the ground and sky. Every skill was earned through pain. A hand who couldn't tie a Honda knot right might lose a steer, or worse, his hand. A rider who didn't know how to sit a sudden bronc learned quickly, or not at all. Out here, lessons were written in scars. Men learned to trust their senses more than instructions. When a horse twitched its ears, when birds flew low, when the air thickened with dust, those were warnings, and ignoring them could cost you your life. There's an old saying from the plains: a cowboy's education is the land's patience running out. Despite their reputation as loners, cowboys lived by cooperation. Drives ran on teamwork, 10 to 15 men moving thousands of cattle in rhythm, each role vital. The trail boss led, the point men steered the front, flankers kept the sides, and drag riders, the toughest job, rode behind in choking dust. When trouble came, and it always did, there was no debate, no delay. A storm might scatter the herd, a river crossing might sweep away gear or men. In those moments, hierarchy vanished. What mattered was skill, not status. The bond was quiet, formed not through words but through shared exhaustion. Men who could barely spell their names trusted each other with their lives. Evening brought stories told in half sentences, laughter over burned beans, and the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Out here, a man's worth wasn't proven by how he talked. It was shown by how he worked when no one was watching. By the mid-1880s, technology began to seep into the range. Factory-forged spurs replaced handmade ones. Ropes, once twisted from local hemp, were shipped in by rail. Saddles were now stamped by brand names: Miles City, Dodge, Fort Worth. But the men still relied on their own ingenuity. A cowboy might rework a broken spur into a buckle, fix a cracked saddle tree with rawhide, or weld a branding iron from scrap metal using a fire pit and a bellows made from canvas. This was practical engineering at its purest, improvisation born from necessity. And though the world called them uneducated, their understanding of material and motion bordered on genius. A drover could judge water depth by the tone of a stone splash, and a foreman could gauge herd size by the low of cattle echoing off canyon walls. It wasn't luck, it was learned geometry. Every man on the range bore proof of his trade. Burns from branding irons, rope scars across the palms, joints stiffened from long rides. Horses bucked, cattle kicked, storms froze them to the bone. Yet few complained. A cowboy's pride was in endurance, the ability to keep moving without drama or self-pity. It was that resilience, more than any myth, that later built the reputation of the West. And when industry came, when the steel rails reached the horizon, those same men were ready. Their bodies were trained for labor, their minds for problem solving. The cowboy didn't vanish when the frontier closed. He simply changed tools. Many became ranch foremen, carpenters, rail builders, mechanics, oil drillers. They traded the horse for the hammer, but the rhythm was the same, work done right, with no shortcuts. They carried their discipline from saddle to soil to steel. For all the mockery they endured, cowboys developed one of the most practical educations in American history. They calculated rations, wages, and distances in their heads. They managed logistics, animal health, and crew morale. They read the weather better than trained meteorologists. But most of all, they learned people how to read a man's eyes before a fight, how to know who'd stand their ground and who'd break under pressure. That kind of knowledge didn't come from schooling, it came from consequence. And as cities grew fat on the cattle they delivered, the myth of their stupidity hardened, the final insult paid to competence that didn't need permission. By sunset, the riders are little more than silhouettes crossing the last mile of daylight. One hums a song nobody wrote down. The herd moves steady, dust hanging gold around them like old glory. They don't talk about the future. They live it, one task at a time. None of them know it yet, but soon the same hands that guide reins and ropes will lay steel rails, erect fences, string wires, and shape a new kind of frontier, one that demands the same courage but a different set of tools. In the towns growing along the rail lines, the laughter of the East grows louder, mocking the very men whose labor feeds its lights. But the mockery won't last forever. By the late 1880s, as the great cattle drives faded and the West settled into fences and freight, the city papers found a new favorite joke, the cowboy. He appeared in cartoons. Boots too big, hat too wide, words too few. The Boston Globe called him a rustic savage. The New York Herald described him as half child, half brute. To the urban mind, he was an amusing leftover from an unfinished chapter, a man who worked hard but thought little. It began with laughter, the kind that travels faster than respect. And in the cafes and drawing rooms of the East, men with soft hands and sharper tongues traded stories about the rawhide philosophers out West, the uneducated horsemen who could no more read a ledger than a Latin poem. They laughed at his manners, his slang, his habit of tipping his hat to women he didn't know. They laughed because mockery is a comfort to those who live far from risk. But out where the wind still smelled of sage and sweat, nobody was laughing. Magazine writers, fresh from universities and boarding schools, traveled west to observe the dying breed. They arrived with notebooks and assumptions, describing the men of the range as specimens, their speech broken, their habits uncivilized. Telegraph wires now carried not just news but opinion, the culture of the East flowing westward faster than wagons could roll. And in that flow came judgment. They missed the quiet intelligence beneath it all, the way a cowboy measured distance by the feel of his horse's breathing, or how he could tell the time by the angle of a shadow. They saw roughness, not resourcefulness. Education, it seemed, was whatever fit between the margins of their books. As railroads brought the East closer to the West, stories began to travel both ways. Dime novels printed by the thousands turned cowboys into caricatures, wild, drunken, illiterate gunmen who lived by chance and died by luck. One writer described a campfire meal as crude sustenance for crude men. He didn't note that those same crude men could prepare that meal under rain, fix a broken stirrup with a strip of hide, and nurse an injured horse through the night, all before dawn's first light. The men who could ride 50 miles through a storm became simpletons. The irony was bitter. The ones who'd mapped rivers by instinct were turned into backward savages. The working class of the frontier had been recast as comic relief for the reading class. Even the word cowboy, once a neutral job title, began to twist in meaning. Boy implied youth, immaturity, a subtle insult wrapped in familiarity. The same culture that depended on their work now found comfort in belittling it. The cowboy was being written out of respect even as his legacy was being sold in print. When a railroad needed timber bridges, it was ex-cowhands who swung the hammers. Back east, men debated progress, steam engines, telephones, universities, while out west, men like Tom Carter or Jesse Black were building it with their hands. When a rancher needed a windmill installed, it was a former drover who climbed the tower. They didn't write essays about democracy, they built its foundations. When new towns needed streets graded and wells dug, it was the same men once mocked for being uneducated who made civilization possible. But for all their work, few were invited into the modern world they'd made. They weren't in the boardrooms or the universities. They were out in the weather, still earning their respect the slow way, through motion, through sweat, through doing. The class divide that would define America was forming right here, one side writing about progress, the other side building it. There's a story from Dodge City, 1887. A reporter from Philadelphia arrived to interview the dying breed. He watched a group of cowboys shoeing horses and repairing harnesses. He asked the foreman what kind of education they had. The reporter didn't write that line down. It didn't fit the narrative. The man looked up, Hammer paused mid-swing and said, "Sir, if you're asking who taught us, it was the land. She's the strictest teacher there is." Instead, his article the next month spoke of illiterate workmen still clinging to outdated ways. He described their hands as coarse, their speech as childlike. What he missed, what so many missed, was that those coarse hands could repair a wagon wheel in an hour, tie 6 types of knots from memory, and read the sky for storms more accurately than his city's best weatherman. The Cowboys never fought the ridicule with words. They fought it by building. The mockery said more about the mockers than the mocked. A cowboy named Luther Haynes once said it plain. In the evenings around the fire, they'd tell stories about the educated fellas who couldn't saddle a horse or light a fire without a matchbook. The laughter was different, not cruel, but knowing. They repaired bridges, laid fence lines, and turned waterless ground into grazing land. They traded jokes, not bitterness. The more the East called them backward, the harder they worked. And he was right. Within a decade, the West's workforce, these uneducated men, would become the builders of modern infrastructure. Roads, rails, irrigation lines, and telegraph towers. The same hands that once held reins would soon hold wrenches and steel hammers. Let them write what they want. When they're hungry, they'll come looking for men who can work. Their reply to mockery was motion, steady, relentless, and righteous. No one laughed at that. The Cowboys' world was changing fast, steel and wire replacing open land. But instead of fading away, these men adapted. They traded rope for rivets, spurs for steel, and built the bones of a new America. As the 19th century closed, the East's laughter grew quieter. There were telegraph poles strung by calloused hands, rails hammered across mountain passes, towns with names like Abilene and Amarillo rising where trail dust once blew. The sound changed first. Where once there had been the low thunder of hooves, now came a sharper rhythm, hammers striking steel, iron on iron, echoing across the valleys. The year was 1890, and the range was no longer just the land of grass and cattle. It had begun to hum. Men who had grown up in the saddle now found themselves standing beside tracks that gleamed like fresh water in the sun. The railroad had arrived not as an intruder but as the next chapter of survival. For years they had driven herds north toward Kansas. Now those herds would ride the rails east, and the men who once herded them began to trade their ropes for wrenches. Some fought the change, others adapted. The skill was different, but the rhythm familiar. Teamwork, endurance, precision. A man who could shoe a horse could drive a spike. A man who could mend leather could fix machinery. And a man who knew the patience of the trail could learn the patience of iron. They built side by side with immigrant crews, Irishmen from the east, Mexicans and black freedmen from the south, Chinese workers from California. There was no classroom here, only the unspoken order of shared purpose. No one asked for degrees, they asked for calluses. Steam engines breathed like beasts of iron, and the cowhands who once roped longhorns now swung sledges that rang against steel. The smell of sweat and grease replaced dust and horsehair. The West was being remade by the very men the East had once called primitive. In towns like Fort Worth and Pueblo, the shift was visible in the faces. Hats once tilted against the sun, now tilted against sparks. The same steady eyes that watched the horizon now watched the arc of molten metal as bridges took shape over rivers once forded on horseback. Progress wasn't some abstract dream out here. It was weight, noise, and heat. It was a man holding his breath while a crane lifted a steel beam into place, praying the bolts would hold. It was the quiet satisfaction of wiping soot from his hands at dusk, knowing he'd helped build something that would outlast him. There was no applause for that kind of work. There never had been. But among the workers, the former riders, ranch hands, and freighters, there was a sense that something had come full circle. For once, they weren't just passing through history, they were anchoring it. The East still joked, of course. Editors in Chicago called them industrial peasants. But their words rang hollow against the sound of progress, thundering westward. Steel bridges rose over canyons, rail spurs reached new towns, and the light from freshly wired stations burned long after the sun went down. Somewhere outside Dodge City, an old cowboy named Eli Foster watched a train cut across the prairie one night, its lanterns streaking through darkness like a comet. He tipped his hat and said to no one in particular, "That's a fine herd they're driving now." He didn't mean the cattle, he meant the country. Out here, no one saw contradiction between horse and rail, or past and future. The men of the range had always lived by adaptation. When the grass dried up, they moved on. When the rivers flooded, they built higher. So when the West turned to iron and steam, they followed, same as before, without asking permission. And though few of them would ever sit behind a desk or hold a title, their fingerprints were everywhere, on the bolts of the bridges, on the gears of the locomotives, on the levees and fences and water towers that now dotted the land they once rode across free. It was hard work, dangerous work. But for men who had stared down lightning and stampedes, danger was just another kind of weather. At sunset, the rail crews sat in silence much like the trail camps once had. Coffee boiling, stories shared, songs hummed low against the wind. The world around them had changed, but the men themselves hadn't. Still loyal to labor, still allergic to boast. By the time the 20th century came roaring in, America was moving faster than anyone could have imagined. But beneath the motion, beneath the engines, the telegraph wires, the warehouses and freight yards, lay the quiet, uncelebrated work of the men who had once been laughed at for their drawl and dust. They had traded open range for open steel, and in doing so they had built the backbone of a modern nation. The towns that rose along the rail lines didn't start as cities. They began as clusters of tents, blacksmith shops and water tanks, a forge here, a saloon there, a church built out of lumber hauled in by mule. You could still smell the prairie under the sawdust. The men who built them weren't graduates of anything except necessity. They had been cowhands, freighters, mule skinners, and fence stretchers. The muscle and mind of the range now finding new purpose in the age of machines. The same discipline that once kept a herd together now kept a work crew on schedule. The same instincts that read storms on the horizon now read the tremor of a steam boiler. In every small town, someone was building something. Roads graded by hand, irrigation ditches carved with shovels, telegraph lines run by horse and wagon. What the city called infrastructure, the men out here simply called a day's work. They didn't see themselves as transforming a nation. They saw themselves as earning supper. Still, something bigger was happening. The frontier, once defined by distance, was now defined by connection. The labor of these uneducated men was weaving a network that would make America one body, rails as veins, wires as nerves, towns as heartbeats. They weren't just surviving change, they were making it possible. A man named Sam Lattimore, once a trail boss, now supervised a crew of 20 on a rail extension west of Amarillo. He had no schooling beyond what the cattle trails had taught him, yet his men said he could read a landscape like a ledger. Sam knew where to find water, where to anchor pilings, and when to stop before a sandhill swallowed the wagons. He'd say little, just point, and the men followed. Leadership wasn't talked about, it was proven, one decision at a time. The companies that hired them noticed. They began to depend on these veterans of the range, men who never asked for rest, who kept their word, who solved problems without sending telegrams for instruction. They were reliable in a way that paperwork could never describe. By 1900, the American West had become an industrial field school, training a generation of workers who could weld, rivet, calculate load weights, and manage crews without formal education. They learned by doing, and by failing, then doing again. If a man broke something, he fixed it. If he didn't know how, he watched another man who did. Knowledge passed hand to hand like a hammer, never written but always remembered. There were dangers too. Steam explosions, falling beams, crushed hands. The kind of lessons progress teaches without mercy. But for men who'd once faced stampedes and rattlesnakes, it wasn't new. Death had always been a coworker. They didn't talk about it much. When someone was lost, the others built on. The job went on. Life went on. What they were really building was not just rail or factory, it was an ethic, the backbone of what would become the American working class. They didn't demand respect. They earned it through repetition, through doing the things no one else wanted to do. When the sun hit the corrugated roofs of the rail depots, it glittered not on monuments or marble, but on sweat. In those years, a quiet shift took place in the soul of the West. The old cowboy pride, independence, endurance, competence merged with the precision of industry. The man of the open trail became the man of the open shop. He learned to measure steel instead of cattle, to read blueprints instead of skylines, but the values stayed the same. It wasn't education that made him capable. It was experience sharpened by responsibility. Some scholars back east began to notice. A few wrote essays about the practical intelligence of the rural laborer, but their words barely reached the men they described. Those men didn't need vindication in print. Their proof stood on concrete foundations, hummed through wires and rolled across tracks. They had built the modern workforce by being exactly who they'd always been, men who worked because work was honorable. By the time the new century rolled in, the cowboy had changed form again. He wore denim instead of chaps, gloves instead of gun belts, and his horse was now an engine. Yet the code remained, don't quit, don't lie, Don't ask for what you haven't earned. He wasn't riding across the prairie anymore. He was welding in a shop, driving a freight truck, running a drill rig. But in each movement, each spark, each swing, each long day, there was the same pulse that once beat through the trails of Texas and the plains of Kansas. The cowboy spirit hadn't died. It had simply gone to work. The men who had once been mocked were now indispensable. Their unrecorded education, imbalance, endurance, adaptation, had become the quiet genius of an entire nation at work. They didn't chase recognition. They didn't demand to be understood. They just kept building. And when the trains rolled eastward again, carrying the goods, the coal, the food, and the steel that would power a new America, there was something poetic, almost divine, in the idea that every wheel turning was still, somehow being driven by the hands of men who once rode horses across open ground. As the new century takes shape, the once ridiculed cowboy begins to fade into myth, his reality forgotten, his likeness sold in storybooks and moving pictures. And the world will soon learn how history chooses its heroes and who it leaves out. By the time the first decade of the new century had settled in, the noise of progress had softened into something steadier, a low hum that carried across the plains. The rail lines no longer ended in wilderness. They ended in towns, and those towns were beginning to look permanent. Water towers rose beside depots. Telegraph poles lined the roads like wooden prayers. Where once there had been only cattle and sky, there were now schools, blacksmiths, and barbers. The West had stopped feeling wild. It had started to feel worked. And yet, beneath the sound of hammers and trains, there was still the pulse of the old life, the quiet discipline of the men who had built it all. They weren't chasing expansion anymore. They were expansion. Every mile of wire strung, every road graded, every bridge repaired became another thread in the great fabric of a united nation. The camera could follow one man, maybe a former trail rider named Amos Pike, working on a telegraph crew outside Lubbock. He'd been a cowboy once, back when the grass ran endless. Now he climbed poles for Western Union, hauling wire instead of rope, balancing on the narrow crossarm like it was a saddle. To him, the work felt familiar. The balance, the risk, the wind in his face, it was all the same, just quieter. He'd drive stakes, stretch lines, and listen to the strange new music of communication. The tapping, the pause, the reply. Every click meant distance conquered. Amos couldn't read Morse, but he knew its meaning, connection. The small towns along those lines grew fast. Cotton gins, feed stores, and grain elevators sprang up beside the rails. Mechanics replaced blacksmiths. Hardware stores sold bolts instead of bridles. And on Sunday mornings, the same men who once rode guard through the night now walked to church with wives and children, wearing clean shirts and boots shined with lard. Progress didn't feel like a revolution. It felt like a slow tide, steady, unremarkable, unstoppable. The cowboy's code, work hard, tell the truth, finish the job, became the civic code of the West. Banks were run by former ranchers. Sheriffs were ex-drovers. Teachers taught children whose fathers had driven herds or laid track. Every structure, from courthouse to grain mill, was a physical memory of what had come before. The East might have mocked them, but the West had quietly built a civilization that could feed and power the whole country. The people who lived it didn't use words like legacy. They said things like getting by or keeping up with the times. But in truth, they were preserving something profound, the idea that work itself carried meaning. Every invention that reached them, the plow, the telegraph, the automobile, was absorbed into their rhythm rather than replacing it. When the first motor cars arrived, ranchers laughed. "You can't drive that thing across the river," they said. A few years later, those same men were using them to haul feed. Adaptation wasn't a choice out here. It was the religion of survival. By 1915, the West was no longer a frontier. It was an economy, a web of farms, oil rigs, and rail depots stretching from the Gulf to the Rockies. But in the evenings, when the sun fell low and the wind carried the smell of mesquite, you could still hear the echo of an older rhythm, the soft clinking of tack from a barn, the whistle of a ranch hand walking home, the steady pride in silence. Progress had not erased the cowboy. It had absorbed him. He was now the foreman supervising the road crew, the lineman stringing power cables, the farmer adjusting the new irrigation valve. He still woke before dawn, still worked until his back ached, still tipped his hat to strangers. The costume had changed, the code had not. The West had modernized, but it had not surrendered. When city officials from back east came through to inspect the new rail junctions, they were surprised. They expected ignorance, found efficiency. They expected superstition, found pragmatism. The men they met could fix engines with nothing but wire and instinct. They could keep a crew alive through a dust storm, or improvise a water pump from spare parts. They didn't quote textbooks, they quoted weather. And when asked how they'd learned to do all this, the answer was always the same. You figure it out or you go hungry. That was the curriculum of the West. The quiet expansion wasn't marked by grand speeches or banners. It was marked by the slow transformation of the land, by fence posts marching in straight lines across the horizon, by the smell of diesel where there once was sage, by the sound of laughter coming from porches instead of campfires. History books would later skip over this era. It had no battles, no heroes, no single defining moment. But in truth, this was the heartbeat of American progress. Men and women who turned the unknown into the ordinary, the dangerous into the dependable. They never called themselves builders of the modern world. They just called it getting the job done. And somewhere deep in that unspoken humility lies the truest kind of greatness, the kind that doesn't need recognition to exist. But while the real cowboys turned to work and quiet purpose, a new version of them, polished, romantic, and false, began to rise in books, on stages, and soon on film. The myth was coming, and it would rewrite the West. The first myths arrived by train, boxes of books and pamphlets unloaded at depot stations, stacked high beside sacks of flour and bolts of fabric. Dime novels, they called them. Cheap, thrilling tales printed back east about a West the writers had never seen. They told stories of duels at sunset, of masked riders and noble gunmen who spoke in perfect grammar and never missed a shot. The real West, the one of dust, sweat, and slow labor, had no place in those pages. The cowboys who'd spent their lives branding cattle and hauling wire now found themselves reborn as legends, stripped of dirt and doubt, dressed up for city imagination. It was strange, even cruel. The same people who had once mocked the cowboy for being uneducated were now selling his image as entertainment. Across the prairies, a man could buy a novel for 10 cents that told him who he supposedly was. Heroic, wild, untamed. None of it was true. But for a generation raised on silence, it was easier to let the lie run than to argue. They had built the modern West. Now the modern West was building a story about them. In small towns, the new myths arrived on posters. Traveling shows came through, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the 101 Ranch exhibitions. Real cowhands stood before crowds in New York, London, and Paris, reenacting the life they'd lived for real just a decade before. They cracked whips, shot blanks, and rode circles in dusty arenas. The audience roared. To them it was adventure. To the performers it was a paycheck, and perhaps a quiet, private grief. Because they knew the truth. They knew that the real cowboy's life was not a string of gunfights and glory, but of broken saddles, frostbitten hands, and long days spent fixing what the wind had ruined. Still, they played along. Because the world no longer paid for reality, it paid for stories. By the 1920s, the myth had become industry. Hollywood found the cowboy and never let him go. On film, he was tall, noble, and always right. He rode alone, spoke little, and solved every problem with a clean punch or a straight shot. The public loved him, a figure of freedom in a world growing crowded with machines. But somewhere in that bright projection light, the real men disappeared. The cowhand who had built bridges was gone. The lineman who climbed poles was forgotten. The myth had stolen their faces, kept their courage, and erased their work. Out in the plains, the men who still lived the old way, ranchers, freighters, small-town laborers, watched those films and said little. Some laughed, some turned away. But deep down, they knew something was being taken. Not their dignity, but their history. The truth had been made too plain to sell. There's a story from 1931. In a small theater in Wichita, a group of old trail hands, gray-haired and stooped, went to see the Virginian. They watched the clean, handsome cowboy ride across a landscape that looked suspiciously tidy. When the movie ended, one of them, a man named Jake Holloway, stood up, adjusted his hat, and said, "Well, boys, I don't remember it being that clean." The others laughed, not bitterly, just knowingly. Because they understood what the world never would, that the real cowboy had never been a hero. He'd been a worker, and that was more than enough. Still, the myth had power. It softened the West, made it approachable, marketable. It gave America a symbol of its better self, courage without cruelty, strength without arrogance. Even if it wasn't true, it was needed. And maybe in some strange way, it was earned. Because under the fiction lay fragments of reality, the decency, the endurance, the unspoken moral code. The stories exaggerated, but they didn't invent those qualities. They simply polished them until the calluses were gone. But the cost was real. As the cowboy became a legend, the working man faded from memory. The rail builders, the fence stretchers, the welders, the mule teams, all the unsung trades that had turned wilderness into a world, vanished into the background. The myth had taken their faces and left their hands invisible. By mid-century, schoolchildren would grow up thinking of the cowboy as a hero of fiction, not history. The frontier became nostalgia, not memory. Yet in the quiet corners of the West, in the barns, workshops, and small towns still living by the old rhythm, the truth endured. Men still rose before dawn. Women still ran the ranches. Work was still prayer. The myth might have rewritten the West, but it could never erase the people who built it. They just didn't write their own stories. They lived them. And maybe that's why they lasted longer than the legends ever would. But history has a way of circling back. And soon, the same world that once mocked these working men for their lack of schooling would come to depend on their wisdom. In the next generation, America would rediscover what the cowboy already knew, that knowledge and education are not the same thing. By the time the Great Depression fell over the country like dust, the cowboy's myth had settled deep into the American mind, but the reality of his spirit was still walking the earth. You could see it in the men who rebuilt bridges after floods, in the farmers who stayed on cracked soil until the rain came back, in the truck drivers who moved grain through storms. They didn't quote philosophers. They just knew what worked, what failed, and what needed doing next. The Depression proved something the West had always known, that when the world collapses, the smartest man in the room is the one who knows how to fix what's broken. Education, in the formal sense, mattered less than competence. When money disappeared, skill became currency. In workshops and barns across the Midwest, men built wind chargers out of scrap metal to power radios. They patched tractors with baling wire, turned broken machinery into usable tools. Every invention was born out of a simple principle: nothing wasted, nothing impossible. It wasn't schooling, it was survival. As factories spread and cities grew, the children of cowhands and ranchers followed opportunity eastward. They became welders, machinists, oil rig workers, truckers, linemen, a quiet army of craftsmen who built modern America with their hands and wits. They carried their parents' lessons like invisible textbooks. Show up early. Do it right the first time. If something breaks, it's your problem until it's fixed. They didn't call it philosophy, they called it Tuesday. The nation's engineers wrote blueprints, but the men on the ground made them work. They found shortcuts that saved hours, solutions that no drafting table could have predicted. And when a young college man came to the job site with clean gloves and instructions, he quickly learned that education didn't always translate to wisdom. One foreman out of Oklahoma put it best: paper tells you what should happen, a wrench tells you what does. The Second World War would prove that more than any textbook ever could. When America began to mobilize, the factories in Texas, Colorado, and California filled with men who could already weld, measure, and repair. They had grown up fixing fences and engines. Now they were building ships and bombers. The cowboys' descendants had traded saddles for rivet guns, but the rhythm was the same: focus, precision, endurance. A Marine corporal from Wyoming once told a reporter, "I never thought riding fence was training for war, but it sure feels like it was." He meant the patience, the calm under pressure, the understanding that every mistake cost something. That quiet discipline, born under open skies, became the backbone of the nation's wartime labor. When the war ended, the country celebrated victory. The men went home and most didn't talk about what they'd done. They just went back to work, building roads, raising barns, expanding power lines, turning a battered world into something usable again. Through all of it, a strange irony lingered. The same country that still romanticized the cowboy in movies had inherited his code through its workforce without realizing it. Hard work, self-reliance, honor, and craft. These were no longer frontier virtues, they were American ones. But few called it that. The men who embodied it didn't write books or give speeches. They worked in silence. Their knowledge passed from father to son, mentor to apprentice, hand to hand. It wasn't an education you could measure by degrees. It was measured by the trust of other men, by being the one others called when the machine wouldn't run, when the engine wouldn't start, when the storm knocked down the line. It was learning through consequence, through repetition, through the unyielding standard of results. Somewhere in western Kansas, an old man leaned against a fence post in 1947, watching his grandson change the oil on a tractor. The boy, fresh from high school, asked, "Grandpa, how'd you learn all this without school?" The old man smiled, squinted into the sun, and said, "Son, I didn't learn it all at once. I learned it every time something broke." That was the creed of the working man, education written not in ink, but in time and scars. By mid-century, the cowboy had become an idea, an image of freedom and courage, but his true legacy was far more useful, a philosophy of doing, of earning, of knowing the world through contact instead of theory. While universities grew and cities rose, the descendants of those first drovers continued to build, fix, and feed the world. They didn't need validation because they lived surrounded by proof, roads, rails, bridges, and homes that stood solid beneath their hands. They were the living continuation of a promise that the nation would always need men and women who understood how things actually worked. And though they no longer wore spurs or rode under open sky, they carried the same quiet authority, the kind that comes from experience, not applause. As the 20th century pressed forward and machines replaced muscle, the spirit of the cowboy didn't fade, it evolved. The tools grew louder, the stakes higher, but the code remained the same: do it right, do it honest, and stand by your work. By the 1950s, the world had changed its skin again. Steel had replaced wood, oil had replaced horses, and machines had taken the weight that men once carried on their backs. But beneath the noise of engines and assembly lines, the heartbeat of the Old West still pulsed, steady, unspoken, indestructible. You could hear it in the clang of a welder's torch, in the low hum of a diesel truck crossing a night highway, in the quiet ritual of a man tightening a bolt just to make sure it's right. These were the sons and grandsons of cowhands, the inheritors of the saddle, now wearing work gloves and coveralls. The cowboy hadn't disappeared. He'd gone to work in the modern world. On the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, the air smelled of iron, sweat, and crude. Roughnecks, many of them descended from ranchers, climbed derricks the way their grandfathers once broke horses, with instinct and courage. A drilling rig was just another kind of beast, unpredictable, dangerous, but manageable if you respected it. They spoke the same old language, short words, long silences. Watch your hand. Keep her steady. Don't quit till it's fixed. Every pipe they laid, every well they brought in, was part of the same unbroken chain stretching back to the first fence post ever driven into prairie ground. In the mines of Colorado, the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the pattern repeated. Men who could read the land now read blueprints. Men who once mended saddles now repaired engines. Those who once tracked herds now managed crews. The tools had changed, but the thinking had not. They still worked from the same unwritten creed: earn it, own it, finish it. Meanwhile, America's image of itself was still caught somewhere between fantasy and memory. On movie screens, the cowboy was a symbol of freedom and decency. In reality, that spirit lived in union halls, welding shops, and truck stops. The working man of the mid-century, the lineman, the mechanic, the carpenter, was the modern embodiment of the cowboy code. He was independent but loyal, humble but skilled, proud but never boastful. He believed in doing things right, even when no one was watching. He didn't wear spurs anymore, but he still walked with the quiet balance of someone who knew the ground beneath him could give way at any time. In small towns, Saturday mornings carried the sound of progress. Pickup trucks idled in front of hardware stores. Men leaned on tailgates trading advice about weather, repairs, and the price of diesel. No one used the word heritage, they just lived it. A father handed his son a wrench the way another man might hand down a rifle. "This'll teach you everything you need to know," he'd say. And it did. Not just about tools, but about patience, precision, and pride. Across the Midwest and the Plains, those lessons became the real inheritance, more valuable than money, more enduring than myth. Because the world still needed men who knew how to build, fix, and endure. And the country, even in its most modern form, still leaned on them like it always had. By the 1970s, machines had taken over much of the cowboys' world, but the mindset persisted wherever labor was honest. In construction yards and oil rigs, on power lines and ranches that refused to close, the descendants of the saddle still showed up before dawn. They didn't talk about legacy. They didn't need to. They carried it in their hands, in their backs, in the rhythm of their days. Every wrench turned, every mile driven, every beam raised was a quiet continuation of a lineage that had begun under open sky, when men were measured not by education or eloquence, but by what they could make stand and what they could make last. And though the East still thought of cowboys as relics of a simpler time, the truth was this: America had become the cowboy's world. Its roads, rails, machines, and morals were all his descendants. The men once mocked as uneducated had built the modern age, and the age had never stopped borrowing their courage. In a welding shop outside Amarillo, an old man named Buck Reynolds, who'd driven cattle as a boy and worked 40 years in steel, once said to a young apprentice, "Don't matter if it's a fence post or a bridge beam, you leave your name on it, not written, made." That was the legacy of leather and iron. Not talk, not myth, Not fame, just the quiet certainty that good work outlives the man who does it. It was the truest kind of immortality. By century's end, the cowboy had become a symbol again, stamped on coffee mugs, printed on shirts, sung about in country songs. But somewhere beneath the nostalgia, the real story still lived. It was the story of hands rough, scarred, and sure, of men and women who turned wilderness into order and order into prosperity, of workers who never asked to be heroes, but who ended up becoming the bones and breath of the nation. The myth had its place, but the truth was better, because the truth was still standing. As the modern world races ahead and technology takes the reins, the last echoes of the cowboy's world fade into memory, but the land remembers, and so do the people who still live by the quiet strength he left behind. There's a kind of silence that lives only in the American West. It settles after sunset, when the wind slows, when the engines cool, when the last truck fades down the road and the air grows still enough to hear distance breathe. It's in that silence that the story of the cowboy still lingers, not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as something deeper, a pulse that never stopped. The land remembers. It remembers the men who rode through it before there were roads, who built fences in wind that could skin your face, who drove cattle through sleet and fire, who hammered the first nails into bridges no one else believed could stand. It remembers the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of rope, the grit of men who worked until work itself became their language. Stand long enough in any forgotten field and you can still find the traces. A piece of barbed wire half buried in soil, a rusted spur, the imprint of a post once driven deep. They're not relics, they're fingerprints. And though the cities have spread, the highways stretched, the towers risen, the spirit that made it all possible has never left. It lives in every man who earns instead of asks, in every woman who works until the job is done, in every calloused hand that still believes dignity is something you make, not something you're given. In small towns across Texas, Kansas, and the Dakotas, old barns lean against the wind like aging soldiers, their boards gray and split but still standing. Inside them hang saddles that haven't seen a horse in 50 years, oil cans from another century, tools passed from father to son, each one a testament not to wealth or fame but to continuity. You can trace the nation's progress in the hands that shaped it. A ranch hand's grip becomes a welder's becomes a mechanic's becomes an engineer's. The tools change, the hands do not. That's the quiet miracle of America, built by people who learned, adapted, and kept faith with work itself. For all its speed and technology, the modern world still depends on that same unspoken promise, that somewhere, someone will know how to fix what breaks. The faces change, the machines evolve, but the soul remains, the belief that competence is sacred, that work is the measure of a man, and that honesty is the only thing you can't counterfeit. In that sense, the cowboy never vanished. He just became harder to see. He's in the man under a truck in the cold, tightening a bolt no one will ever notice. He's in the woman running a ranch alone after the bank takes its due. He's in the lineman who climbs into a storm while the rest of the world hides inside. They are all still out there, uncelebrated, essential, and honest. If you drive west at dusk, past the last line of suburbs, you can still catch it, that same smell of dust and grass, that same wide silence stretching farther than the eye can travel. You might see an old windmill turning slow, or the outline of a man closing a gate before nightfall. You won't know his name. You don't need to, because he isn't a relic. He's the reason the lights stay on, the wheels keep turning, the country keeps standing. He's the living echo of every cowboy who ever shouldered a day's work without complaint, who built more than he took, who left the world steadier than he found it. And maybe that's what the East never understood, that education can teach you how to live, but work teaches you why. The cowboy knew why. He always did. So when the world looks back, past the headlines, past the myths, past the noise, it will find that the modern West wasn't built by stories or slogans, but by men and women who believed that skill, sweat, and decency were worth something. They didn't build it perfect. They built it honest. And if you stand still long enough in the fields they once crossed or the towns they left behind, you can still feel it, that steady, unbroken hum beneath the wind. The land remembers the hands that shaped it, and it always will. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of the kind of work, pride, and grit that built this country, take a second to keep it alive. Hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes a good day's work is something to be proud of. Because history isn't just what's written down, it's what we choose to remember.